The man's face, what I could see of it, was a frozen mask of resignation. The rope, stiff with ice, creaked against the gallows crossbeam, a mournful sound in the sudden biting wind. They were going to hang him right here on the edge of nothing, as the sky turned a malevolent shade of grey. I'd seen my share of hangings, but this one felt different. It wasn't justice. It was a lynching, plain and simple. And as the first flakes of what would become the great schoolhouse blizzard of '88 began to fall, I knew I couldn't just stand by and watch another soul be swallowed by the unforgiving Wyoming winter. My name is Abigail, and this is the story of how I saved a dead man, and in doing so ignited a fire that threatened to consume us all. The wind had teeth, not the playful nip of an autumn breeze, but the vicious, tearing bite of a predator. It ripped across the high plains of Wyoming, scouring the sparse, frost-hardened grass and driving needles of ice into any exposed flesh. I pulled the rough wool collar of my coat tighter around my neck, my knuckles already numb, my breath pluming in a cloud that was instantly snatched away. Below me in the hollow that passed for the main street of Flicker Creek, a small cluster of men were gathered around the town's sorry excuse for a gallows. It wasn't an official structure, just 2 thick posts sunk into the frozen earth, with a crossbeam erected by men who believed their brand of justice was swifter and purer than any judge's. Their target stood on a buckboard wagon, hands bound behind him, a noose already cinched around his neck. He was Lakota, that much was clear from his high cheekbones and the proud, defiant set of his jaw, even in the face of death. He wore buckskins worn and trail-dusted, but they couldn't hide the lean strength in his frame. He was alone, surrounded by the hard, unforgiving faces of ranchers, their expressions a mixture of grim satisfaction and righteous fury. The leader of the pack was Jedediah Thorne, a man whose shadow seemed to fall long and cold, even on the brightest day. Thorne owned the biggest spread in the territory, the Double T Ranch, and he ruled it with an iron fist and a silver-plated colt. He claimed the Lakota man had stolen cattle. It was a common enough accusation, and often enough a false one. A convenient excuse to remove one more native from land the ranchers coveted. "Let's get this over with, Jedediah." One of the men shouted, his voice thin against the rising gale. "This ain't no weather for a hangin'." Thorne, a bull of a man with a thick graying beard that collected ice, spat a stream of tobacco juice that froze before it hit the ground. "Justice don't wait on the weather," he boomed his voice, carrying even over the wind's howl. "This savage needs to be made an example of." I watched from the ridge overlooking the town, my horse Boudica shifting restlessly beneath me. I shouldn't have been there. I should have been safe in my cabin miles away with a fire roaring and the door barred against the world. But I'd needed supplies, and the trip to Flicker Creek had already been a fool's errand. The air had felt wrong all morning, heavy and charged with a strange oppressive energy. The old-timers called it a blizzard sky. Now that sky was churning the color of a fresh bruise, and the temperature was plummeting with terrifying speed. The first flakes began to fall then. They weren't the gentle drifting flakes of a picturesque snowfall. They were small, hard, and sharp, like grains of sand, and they came down with a vengeance driven almost horizontally by the wind. Within minutes, the world was a swirling vortex of white. The men around the gallows became indistinct shapes, their shouts swallowed by the storm's roar. This was my chance. It was madness. It was suicide. But I couldn't shake the image of the man's face. It wasn't fear I'd seen there, but a profound and weary acceptance. The same acceptance I had seen in my own father's eyes moments before a different kind of rope had taken him. "Easy, girl," I whispered to Boudica, my voice tight. I urged her down the slick, rapidly whitening slope, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The chaos was my cloak. The ranchers were disoriented, blinded by the snow, their attention torn between their prisoner and the sudden violent onslaught of the blizzard. They were fumbling with their horses, trying to pull their hats down, cursing the heavens. I rode into the heart of the maelstrom, a ghost in the gale. I drew the hunting knife from the sheath on my belt, its steel cold and solid in my gloved hand. The man on the buckboard saw me first. His eyes, dark and piercing, widened in disbelief. There was no time for words, no time for anything but the desperate, insane act I was about to commit. I spurred Boudica alongside the wagon. The horse, bless her brave heart, didn't shy. She planted her feet as I stood precariously in the stirrups, leaning over the side of the wagon. The rope was thick and frozen solid, more like a cable of ice than hemp. I hacked at it, my arm jarring with each blow. The fibers groaned, then one by one, they snapped. The man fell not gracefully, but in a heap, crumpling to the floor of the buckboard as the severed noose whipped past his head. "Get up!" I screamed, the wind tearing the words from my lips. For a moment he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then Thorne's voice cut through the blizzard's howl. "What in the devil's name? It's that crazy woman from the hills. Stop her!" A gunshot cracked the sound flat and dead in the thick, snowy air. A bullet whined past my ear. That broke the spell. The Lakota man surged to his feet, his movements surprisingly fluid for someone who had been moments from death. He launched himself from the wagon and landed with a soft thud in the snow on the other side. I didn't wait to see more. I wheeled Boudica around her hooves, churning through the rapidly deepening drifts. The world was a blur of white, the town and the men in it vanishing as if they had never been. I could only pray the man was following, that I hadn't just delayed his death by a few miserable minutes. The wind was a physical force, now a solid wall of ice and fury that threatened to push us back to bury us. Visibility was non-existent. I was navigating by instinct alone, relying on my knowledge of the terrain and Boudica's sure-footedness. The temperature had dropped so far, so fast, that the snow squeaked under her hooves. This was no ordinary storm. This was a monster. This was the schoolhouse blizzard, though we wouldn't have a name for it until later. At that moment, it was simply the end of the world. I risked a glance behind me, my eyes stinging and watering from the cold. A figure was there, a dark shape against the blinding white, stumbling but keeping pace. He was still with me. My cabin was my only hope, a tiny speck of shelter in an ocean of frozen hostility. It was miles away, and every yard would be a battle against the elements. As the full, terrifying force of the blizzard descended, a single thought echoed in my mind, a frantic, desperate prayer. What in God's name have I done? The journey to my cabin was a nightmare etched in ice. The world dissolved into a howling, featureless void of white. The wind shrieked a banshee's lament that clawed at our clothes and stole the breath from our lungs. There was no up, no down, only the relentless, horizontal assault of the snow. I bent low over Boudica's neck, my face buried in her mane, trusting her instincts as much as my own memory of the land. Every rock, every dip, every skeletal tree was a landmark I had memorized over years of solitude. Now they were my only guideposts in a world erased. Behind me, the Lakota man followed. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence, a persistent shadow in the maelstrom. He was on foot, his hands still bound, yet he endured. Several times I thought I'd lost him, the sickening lurch in my gut, telling me he'd finally succumbed. But then a flicker of movement in the chaos would reassure me. He was a ghost, a stubborn spirit, refusing to be exorcised by the storm. It felt like an eternity, but finally Boudica stumbled to a halt, her sides heaving. Through the blinding snow, I recognized the faint, dark outline of the pine trees that sheltered my cabin. We had made it. I slid from the saddle, my legs numb and clumsy. "We're here!" I yelled, the words barely audible over the gale. He materialized beside me, his face a mask of snow and ice, his dark hair frozen stiff. He was shivering violently, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook his entire body. The rope on his wrists was caked in ice, a frozen manacle. Without a word, I drew my knife again and sawed through the stiff fibers. He didn't thank me, just rubbed his raw, purpled wrists, his eyes scanning the cabin, the trees, the suffocating wall of white around us. His gaze was wary, calculating. He was a wolf I had dragged into my den, and I was under no illusions that he was tamed. The cabin was small, just a single room, built from sturdy pine logs I had felled and stripped myself. It was my fortress, my sanctuary. The door was frozen shut, and it took our combined weight, pushing against the wind's relentless pressure, to force it open. We stumbled inside into the frigid, still darkness. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The wind's scream was muffled to a low moan, the biting cold replaced by a bearable chill. I slammed the heavy door shut and slid the thick wooden bar into place. We were safe for now. We stood in the gloom, two strangers bound by a storm and an act of impulsive defiance. He was a silhouette against the pale light filtering through the snow-caked window. I could hear his ragged breaths, the chattering of his teeth. "There's a lantern on the table," I said, my own voice hoarse. "And matches." He didn't move. His silence was unnerving, a heavy weight in the small room. I fumbled my way to the stone fireplace, my numb fingers searching for the flint and steel I kept on the mantel. The spark caught on the tinder, and a small flame flickered to life. I fed it kindling, then larger pieces of wood from the stack beside the hearth. The fire crackled, spitting and hissing, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. In the growing light, I saw him clearly for the first time. He was younger than I'd thought, perhaps in his mid-20s. The harsh lines of defiance I'd seen on the gallows had softened, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it seemed to be carved into his very bones. His face was gaunt, his lips blue with cold. The rope burn on his neck was a raw, angry welt. He was watching me, his dark eyes missing nothing. There was no gratitude in them, only a deep, guarded intensity. He was assessing me, the cabin, the situation. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," I said, turning away to give him a semblance of privacy. I went to a large wooden chest at the foot of my bed and pulled out a heavy wool blanket and some of my late father's old clothes, a pair of trousers and a thick shirt. They would be too big for him, but they were dry and warm. I placed them on the table without looking at him. "There's a basin and water by the stove. It will be warm soon." I busied myself making coffee, the familiar ritual a comfort in the tense silence. I could hear him moving, the soft rustle of clothes. When I turned back, he had stripped to the waist. His body was a road map of old scars, a testament to a life of hardship and conflict. But he was also leanly muscled, built, with the efficient strength of a predator. He washed himself with the now steaming water, his movements economical and precise. He pulled on the dry clothes, the too large shirt, hanging loosely on his frame. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and moved to the fire, sinking down onto the hearth, his hands outstretched to the flames. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the blizzard outside. The storm was not abating. If anything, it was growing stronger. Snow drifted through the cracks in the door, and the wind moaned in the chimney. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice a low, rough baritone. He was still staring into the fire. I knew what he was asking. Why had I saved him? I had been asking myself the same question. "They weren't giving you a trial," I answered, simply pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. "It was a lynching, and that is your concern. I don't like seeing men strung up for sport," I said, handing him a mug. Our fingers brushed. His skin was still ice cold. He took the mug, his eyes briefly meeting mine. They were like chips of obsidian, hard and deep. "They said I stole cattle," he stated, not as a question but as a fact. "Jedediah Thorne is a liar and a thief himself," I retorted, sipping my own coffee. The hot liquid was a balm to my raw throat. "He wants all this land. He wants your people gone." A flicker of something surprise, interest crossed his face. He said nothing, just drank his coffee, his gaze returning to the hypnotic dance of the flames. The hours crept by. The world outside was a roaring white hell. We were trapped, 2 people from different worlds, marooned on a tiny island of warmth and light. The initial tension began to ease, replaced by a shared understanding of our predicament. We were allies for now, united against a common enemy, the storm. I made a simple stew from dried meat and vegetables. We ate in silence, the unspoken questions hanging in the air between us. Who was he? Why was he really here? And what would happen when the blizzard finally ended? Later, as the light from the window faded into an eerie, perpetual twilight, I tended to the gash on his neck. He sat stiffly as I cleaned it with whiskey and applied a salve of comfrey and yarrow. He flinched when the alcohol stung, but otherwise made no sound. "You have some skill in this," he observed, his voice neutral. "You learn what you have to when you live alone," I replied, my fingers working gently. "You have been alone long enough." I finished tying the bandage, my hands retreating quickly from the warmth of his skin. The intimacy of the act was unsettling. He looked at me then, a long, searching look. "My name is Nakoma," he said. "I'm Abigail," I replied. It was a simple exchange, but it felt significant. A first step across the chasm that separated us. We were no longer just a savage and a crazy woman from the hills. We were Nakoma and Abigail, and we were trapped in the heart of the schoolhouse blizzard with the wolves of the world waiting just outside our door. We didn't know it yet, but the storm was the least of our worries. The real blizzard, the one of blood and vengeance, was still to come. The second day was worse than the first. The blizzard did not relent. It intensified, as if angered by our survival. The wind screamed like a tortured soul, and the snow piled in great sculpted drifts against the cabin, burying the windows, plunging our world into a dim, perpetual twilight. The fire was our sun, our only source of light and life. The cabin, once my spacious sanctuary, now felt like a cage, the log walls closing in. Time lost its meaning. There was only the cycle of feeding the fire, melting snow for water, and the oppressive, heavy silence between us. Nakoma was a quiet presence, watchful and reserved. He moved with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with his powerful frame. He spent hours staring into the flames, his face a stoic mask. But I could see the turmoil in his eyes. He was a man carrying a heavy burden, and the storm had given him too much time to think about it. We spoke in fragments, small offerings to fill the vast silence. I told him about my father, a prospector who had chased dreams of gold until his luck ran out, leaving me this small patch of land and a deep-seated distrust of men who promised easy fortunes. He listened, his head tilted slightly, his dark eyes never leaving my face. He in turn told me of the plains of the buffalo, of a way of life that was vanishing like smoke on the wind. He spoke not with anger, but with a profound aching sadness that resonated with my own sense of loss. "The white man," he said one evening, his voice a low rumble. "He does not understand the land. He cuts it, fences it, owns it. To us the land owns us. We are part of it, like the river and the sky." On the third day the food was running low. The last of the dried meat was gone, and only a handful of potatoes and some flour remained. Starvation was becoming a real and present danger, another predator stalking us in our confinement. I was checking our meager supplies when Nakoma spoke from behind me. "Thorne's ranch is north of here, but there is a line cabin for his winter patrols. Not far, maybe 2 miles. I turned to face him, surprised. "How do you know that?" "I have watched this land for many moons," he said simply. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small space. "The cabin will have supplies, canned goods, smoked meat." 2 miles. I scoffed, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. "It might as well be 100. It's suicide to go out in that." "It is suicide to stay here and starve." He counted, his gaze unwavering. He was right. The fire was our friend, but it was also a hungry beast devouring our wood supply. Soon we would have to choose between freezing and starving. How would we even find it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. We can't see 10 feet in front of our faces. "I can find it," he said, and there was a certainty in his voice that was absolute. "The wind has been from the north since the storm began. It is our compass. And the trees, they tell a story if you know how to listen." The plan was madness, but it was the only plan we had. We spent the next hour preparing, reinforcing our clothing with extra layers, wrapping our faces in scraps of cloth. I gave him my father's old snowshoes and took a spare pair for myself. As I handed him my hunting rifle, our eyes met. "You trust me with this?" he asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "I trust that you want to live as much as I do," I replied, "and I'm a better shot." I held up my own Colt revolver, a wry smile touching my lips for the first time in days. He returned the smile, a fleeting ghost of a thing that transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. A fair division of labor. Stepping outside was like stepping onto another planet. The force of the wind knocked me back, and the cold was a physical blow so intense it burned. The world was a chaotic, roaring whiteness. I couldn't see the hand in front of my face. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. Then Nakoma's hand was on my arm, his grip firm, grounding. "Stay close," he yelled over the storm. "Follow my steps." He moved forward, leaning into the wind, a solitary, determined figure battling the storm's fury. I followed, my eyes fixed on the dark shape of his back, my life in his hands. He was right about the trees. He seemed to read them like a map, noting the direction of the snow piled on their trunks, the angle of their frozen branches. He was a part of this wild, unforgiving nature in a way I could never be. He was not fighting the storm. He was moving with it. It was a brutal, soul-crushing trek. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, and my hope dwindled with every agonizing step. Just when I thought I could go no further, that I would simply lie down and let the snow claim me, a dark shape loomed out of the swirling white. The line cabin. It was half buried in snow, but it was real. The door was unlocked. We stumbled inside into the dark, frigid interior. Nakoma found a lantern and lit it, revealing a small, rough-hewn room. And on the shelves, a miracle tins of beans, sacks of flour, salted pork coffee. We had found salvation. We built a fire in the small pot-bellied stove, and as the warmth slowly seeped back into our frozen limbs, a sense of giddy relief washed over me. We had done it. We had faced the monster and won. We ate greedily, scalding our mouths on hot beans, straight from the can. The food was manna from heaven. As we sat by the stove, the shared danger and triumph forged a new, deeper connection between us. The walls of mistrust had been breached. It was then, in the flickering light of the lantern, surrounded by the spoils of our desperate gamble, that he finally told me everything. Thorne did not lie when he said I was on his land. Nakoma began, his voice low and serious, but he lied about why. He paused, gathering his thoughts. My father is Chief Black Moon of the Oglala Lakota. He is a great warrior, but he is old now, and he sees the world changing. He sees the buffalo disappearing and our people starving. He knows the path of war leads only to more graves. He looked at me, his eyes burning with an intensity that held me captive. He sent me to talk peace, not with the white soldiers, not with the men in Washington. Their tongues are forked, their promises are empty. He sent me to talk to the ranchers, to the men who live here, to men like Thorne. I stared at him, the implications of his words crashing down on me. The man I had pulled from a noose was not a common thief. He was an envoy, a prince of his people on a mission of peace. We offered a treaty. Nakoma continued, his voice laced with the bitterness of his failure. To define the boundaries, to share the water, to end the cycle of raids and revenge. Some of the smaller ranchers, they were willing to listen. They are tired of the fighting. But Thorne wants everything. He profits from the conflict. It allows him to expand his land, to drive out his rivals, to get rich, selling beef to the army forts. So he ambushed you, I whispered, and the pieces clicking into place. He and his men. They killed the 2 warriors who rode with me. They were going to hang me and claim it was justice for cattle theft. My death would be the spark that ignites a new war, a war that would see my people wiped out, and Thorne the undisputed king of this territory. I finally understood. The hanging, the blizzard, our desperate struggle for survival. It was all part of a much larger, more dangerous game. I had not just saved a man's life. I had interfered in the fate of nations. I had stumbled into the heart of a war, and Thorne would not be deterred by a storm. He would come for us. He would hunt us down to silence the truth Nakoma carried. The wind howled outside the line cabin, a mournful, lonely sound. But for the first time, it was not the storm I feared. It was the silence that would follow. It was the wrath of Jedediah Thorne. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was coming. The relative safety of the line cabin was a temporary reprieve, a breath held in the heart of the storm. We knew it couldn't last. Jedediah Thorne was not a man to be thwarted by God or nature. His greed was a force more relentless than any blizzard. For 2 days we holed up in that small, rough shelter, gathering our strength. We ate Thorne's food, drank his coffee, and used his firewood, an irony that brought a grim smile to my face. The truce between Nakoma and me had deepened, forged into a true alliance by shared hardship and the weight of his revelation. We were no longer just Abigail and Nakoma. We were a pact, a 2-person army against the world. We planned our next move. We couldn't stay. Thorne would eventually check his line cabins, and we couldn't go back to my place. It was the first place he would look once the storm broke. There are caves in the Black Hills to the east, Nakoma said, sketching a map in the frost on the window pane. Hidden, sacred places. We could be safe there. My people could find us. The Black Hills are 50 miles away, I said, the daunting distance settling like a stone in my stomach. We'd never make it on foot, not in this. We won't be on foot, he said, a strange glint in his eye. Thorne keeps horses here, 2 of them, in the lean-to behind the cabin. It was a daring plan, almost as mad as our trek through the blizzard, but it was our only hope. We would wait for the first sign of the storm breaking, then ride for the hills, for the sanctuary Nakoma spoke of. The storm began to change on the 5th day. The wind's ceaseless, high-pitched scream lessened to a deep, guttural moan. The snowfall lightened. The world outside was no longer an impenetrable wall of white, but a landscape of immense rolling drifts, a frozen alien sea. "It's breaking," I whispered, peering through a small patch I'd cleared on the window. "We should go. Soon." Nakoma was standing by the door, his head cocked, listening. "Wait," he said, his voice a low command. "What is it?" "Horses," he breathed. "More than 2." My blood ran cold. I listened, straining to hear past the wind's cry. And then I heard it. The muffled crunch of hooves in deep snow, the jingle of harness. They were close. Too close. I grabbed my rifle, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Nakoma moved to the window, peering cautiously from the edge. His body went rigid. "It's him," he said, his voice grim. "Thorne, and at least 4 of his men." Panic, hot and suffocating, threatened to overwhelm me. We were trapped. The line cabin, our salvation, had become our tomb. There was no back door, no escape route. "How did they find us?" I hissed, my mind racing. "The storm. They are trackers," Nakoma said, his voice calm, steadying. "And Thorne is like a wolf. Once he has the scent, he does not stop." He turned from the window, his face set like stone. All trace of the quiet man who spoke of the land was gone. In his place was the warrior, the son of Chief Black Moon. "We fight," he said. It was not a question. We had seconds to prepare. I moved to the far side of the room, taking cover behind the heavy wooden table I'd tipped on its side. Nakoma flattened himself against the wall next to the door, my father's old hunting knife in his hand. The rifle was in my hands, its wooden stock smooth and familiar. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A moment of chilling silence, then Thorne's voice boomed, magnified by the snow-dampened air. "I know you're in there, Abigail, and I know you've got my property with you, the horse thief. Send him out now, and I might just let you live." His voice was confident, arrogant. He thought he had us cornered. He thought I was just a scared woman he could intimidate. "Go to hell, Thorne!" I yelled back, my voice shaking only slightly. A chuckle from outside. "Spirit. I always did admire that in a woman. A shame I'll have to break it." He paused. "I'm giving you to the count of 3. Then we're coming in. And we won't be gentle. 1. I glanced at Nakoma. He met my gaze, his eyes dark and resolute. A silent understanding passed between us. We would not be taken alive. 2. I took a deep breath, the smell of gunpowder and pine filling my lungs. I rested the rifle barrel on the edge of the overturned table. My aim steady on the center of the door. My finger tightened on the trigger. 3. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound and violence. The heavy wooden door shuddered, then burst inward, ripped from its hinges by the combined force of 3 men. As the first man stumbled through the doorway, a hulking figure silhouetted against the grey light, my rifle bucked against my shoulder. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and crumpled to the floor. Before the others could react, Nakoma sprang. He moved like a striking snake, a blur of motion. He drove the knife into the side of the second man, who had been right behind the first. The man screamed a high, thin sound that was quickly cut off as Nakoma twisted the blade. The third man, younger, with wide, terrified eyes, froze in the doorway, his pistol half raised. He stared at his 2 fallen comrades, then at the ferocious, knife-wielding figure of Nakoma. He was just a boy, a hired hand caught up in something far beyond his understanding. "Drop it!" I screamed at him, but before he could obey, a 4th figure pushed past him, shoving him aside. It was Jedediah Thorne. He was a giant of a man, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. In his hands he held a double-barreled shotgun. He ignored me. He ignored the dead and dying men at his feet. His eyes, burning with a malevolent fire, were fixed on Nakoma. "Savage," Thorne snarled, raising the shotgun. "I'll see you in hell." Everything seemed to slow down. I saw Nakoma tense, preparing to lunge to sell his life dearly. I saw Thorne's knuckles whiten as he squeezed the triggers. I knew I couldn't reload my rifle in time. It was over. Then from the doorway, the young ranch hand, the one with the terrified eyes, did something unexpected. Whether out of fear, confusion, or a sudden, inexplicable crisis of conscience, he stumbled forward directly into Thorne's path. "Boss, no!" he cried. Thorne, enraged, shoved the boy violently. The boy fell backward, tripping over the threshold. But it was enough. The momentary distraction, the slight shift in his aim, was all we needed. Nakoma launched himself not at Thorne, but to the side, diving behind the pot-bellied stove. At the same instant, both barrels of Thorne's shotgun roared, the blast so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. The wall where Nakoma had been standing just a second before erupted in a spray of splintered wood and lead shot. The air was thick with gunpowder smoke, the smell of blood, and the electric charge of imminent death. 2 of Thorne's men were down. The young one was scrambling backward into the snow. And Thorne was standing in the doorway, a smoking shotgun in his hands, a murderous promise in his eyes. The wolves were not at the door anymore. They were inside. The siege had begun. The cabin became a crucible, a roaring inferno of splintered wood and gunpowder. Thorne stood in the ruined doorway, a demonic silhouette against the bleak grey light of the blizzard's end. The twin barrels of his shotgun smoked, and his broad chest heaved with rage. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a cornered beast, and the scent of blood had driven him mad. "You should have stayed out of it, Abigail." he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. He began to reload his movements, swift and practiced. He was mine. This land is mine. Nakoma, crouched behind the pot-bellied stove, was a coil of pure potential energy. The shotgun blast had missed him by inches, peppering the wall with a deadly spray of buckshot. He held the bloody knife, his knuckles white. "This land does not belong to you." Nakoma's voice was low, but it cut through the smoky air. "You are a disease upon it." That was all it took. With a roar, Thorne shouldered his reloaded shotgun. I didn't hesitate. From my position behind the overturned table, I fired the Colt. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Thorne's shoulder, spinning him half around. He howled in pain and fury, the shotgun discharging into the ceiling, bringing down a shower of dust and splinters. The fifth man, who had been lurking outside, chose that moment to make his move. He charged into the cabin, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of grim determination. He wasn't a boy like the one who had fled. This was a hard man, a seasoned fighter. Nakoma met his charge. It wasn't a brawl. It was a deadly dance. The man fired his pistol, the shot going wide, as Nakoma deflected his arm. The knife in Nakoma's hand became a blur. There was a sickening wet thud, and the hard man's eyes went wide. He looked down at the hilt of the knife protruding from his chest as if in mild surprise, then collapsed in a heap. Thorne, clutching his bleeding shoulder, had staggered back against the door frame. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with an unholy light. He had dropped the shotgun and was fumbling for the silver-plated Colt at his hip. The odds had evened, but we were still trapped. Thorne was between us and the only exit. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood. 3 men lay dead or dying on the floor of the small cabin. It was a butcher's shop. "We can't stay here," I breathed, my voice tight. "He'll bleed us out." Nakoma nodded his eyes, never leaving Thorne. He retrieved his knife, wiping the blade on the dead man's trousers. "The window," he mouthed. "It was our only chance." The single window was on the wall opposite the door. It was small, but perhaps large enough for a person to squeeze through. "I'll keep him busy," I said, my heart hammering. I took a deep breath, raised my head slightly above the table, and fired another shot in Thorne's direction. I didn't aim to hit him just to keep his head down. The bullet slammed into the log wall a foot from his head, showering him with splinters. He cursed and fired back, the bullet thudding into the thick oak of my makeshift barricade. Under the cover of the exchange, Nakoma moved. He was a phantom, silent and swift, crawling along the floor, keeping below the line of sight from the door. He reached the wall beneath the window. I risked another shot. "You're a murderer and a land grabber." "Thorne," I yelled, trying to keep his attention focused on me. "Everyone will know what you did. Dead people don't tell stories," he roared back, firing again. I felt the impact as the bullet slammed into the table, the wood groaning in protest. Nakoma was at the window. He used the butt of his knife to smash the glass, the sound sharp and tinkling against the backdrop of gunfire. He quickly cleared the jagged shards from the frame. "Go," he urged, looking back at me. "Get to the horses. Not without you. Go, I will follow." There was no time to argue. I trusted him. I had to. I scrambled from behind the table, staying low, and crab-crawled towards the window. Thorne saw the movement and wheeled around, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He fired his Colt, the bullet screaming past my head, so close I felt the heat of its passage. I tumbled to the floor by the window. Nakoma grabbed my arm, his grip like iron, and hauled me to my feet. "Climb," he commanded. I scrambled onto a small crate he'd kicked into place and pushed myself head first through the narrow opening. The cold air was a shock, but a welcome one. I fell clumsily into a deep snowdrift outside the soft powder cushioning my fall. I looked back to see Nakoma preparing to follow. But Thorne was no fool. He was charging across the cabin, his face a murderous visage. He wouldn't let us escape. Nakoma wasn't trying to climb through. He was waiting. As Thorne closed the distance, Nakoma kicked the crate out from under the window and then kicked the heavy pot-bellied stove with all his might. The stove, its iron legs already unsteady on the rough floorboards, tipped over with a deafening crash. The stovepipe ripped from the ceiling, and red-hot coals and burning logs spilled across the floor, instantly igniting the dry wood and the spilled kerosene from a broken lantern. Flames erupted with a hungry whoosh. The cabin, our shelter, and our battleground was turning into a death trap. Thorne skidded to a halt, the sudden wall of fire separating him from Nakoma. He screamed in frustration, a sound of pure animal rage. Nakoma didn't hesitate. He vaulted through the window, landing with a light thud in the snow beside me. "The horses!" he yelled, pulling me to my feet. We ran, stumbling through the deep snow towards the lean-to. Behind us, the fire roared, black smoke pouring from the window and the ruined doorway. I could hear Thorne's enraged screams, swallowed by the crackle of the flames. The horses in the lean-to were terrified, their eyes wide, pulling at their tethers. Nakoma spoke to them in low, soothing Lakota, his calm presence working a strange magic. While he untied them, I looked back at the burning cabin. A figure emerged from the flames, wreathed in smoke and fire, like a demon from hell. It was Thorne. His clothes were smoldering, his hair and beard singed. He held his Colt in his hand, and he was coming after us. The man's sheer, malevolent will was terrifying. He would not be stopped. "Abigail!" Nakoma shouted. He threw me onto the back of one horse and swung himself onto the other. There was no time for saddles, no time for anything. I grabbed a handful of mane, my legs clinging to the horse's sides. Nakoma took the lead, and we plunged into the surreal snow-covered wilderness, leaving the burning cabin and the demoniac figure of Jedediah Thorne behind us. We rode hard, the wind stinging our faces, the terrified horses flying over the snow. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel Thorne's hatred, a cold shadow stretching across the snow, pursuing us. The siege of the cabin was over, but the hunt had just begun. We rode like thieves, the horses stolen from our enemy, churning through the deep snow. The burning cabin vanished behind us, and we were alone, two fugitives in a vast white wilderness. Nakoma, guided by an instinct I couldn't comprehend, led us through a maze of ravines until we found shelter in a shallow rock overhang, a miserable nook that offered some respite from the wind's incessant howl. As we dismounted, the adrenaline that had fueled me began to drain away, leaving a cold, heavy dread in its place. The full weight of the day crashed down. Men were dead. I had killed one of them. My hands, still gripping the Colt, began to tremble. "We are safe here for now," Nakoma said, his voice a low counterpoint to the wind. He tended to the horses with a steady, calming presence. "He won't stop," I whispered, the image of Thorne emerging from the flames, wreathed in smoke and fury, burned into my mind. "He's not just a man." Nakoma came and sat beside me. "He is a man consumed by a sickness of greed," he said, his gaze finding my shaking hands. "What you did in that cabin, Abigail, was the act of a warrior." "I'm not a warrior," I retorted, a dry sob catching in my throat. "I'm a killer." "You are a survivor," he corrected gently but firmly. "You fought for your life and for mine." As a heavy silence fell between us, a new sound cut through the wind, the labored crunch of footsteps in the snow. Someone was approaching, Instantly, we were on alert. I raised the Colt, my hand now steady. Nakoma drew his blood-stained knife, his body a tense shadow. A figure stumbled into the dim light of our overhang, his hands held high in surrender. It was Billy, the young ranch hand from the cabin, his face a mask of terror and exhaustion. "Don't shoot," he pleaded, his voice thin and cracking. "I'm not here to fight." "You're one of Thorne's men." I snarled, the pistol unwavering. "Give me one good reason not to put a bullet in you." The words tumbled from his lips in a panicked rush. "Because your father saved my life." The world stopped. The wind, the cold, the ache in my bones. It all vanished. "What did you say?" "Your father," Billy repeated, taking a hesitant step forward. "Daniel Hayes, the prospector. He pulled me from a freezing river years ago. I was just a kid. He saved me. I never forgot him." My mind reeled. "My father is dead," I said, my voice flat. "I know." Billy said, his voice filled with a genuine sorrow that chipped at my armor. "And I know it wasn't no accident at the mine. Thorne did it. I heard him bragging about it. Your father's claim was rich, and he wouldn't sell. Thorne had the support beams sabotaged. The dull, years-long ache of grief I had carried transformed in an instant, crystallizing into a white-hot, focused rage. He was murdered. The man hunting me now, the man who had tried to lynch Nakoma to start a war, was the same man who had killed my father. It was all one long, bloody story. "Why tell me this now?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fury. "When I saw you," Billy said, "I knew you were his daughter. I ain't no killer, ma'am. I couldn't let his daughter be murdered by the man who killed him." He looked frantically between us. "Thorne's still out there. He sent for reinforcements, but he's circling back, hunting you himself. He'll find you by morning." I lowered the Colt, my arm suddenly heavy. The rage hadn't vanished. It had cooled into something solid and deadly. It now had a purpose. "He'll expect us to run for the Black Hills," I said, thinking aloud. "He'll be waiting for us on the trail." Nakoma, who had listened in utter silence, met my gaze. A new, terrible understanding passed between us. The wolf would expect his prey to flee. "So where," Nakoma asked quietly, his eyes boring into Billy's, "is the one place he would never expect us to go?" Billy's eyes widened as he grasped the suicidal logic. "Back towards the ranch," he whispered, "into the heart of his own land." The plan formed in the cold, dark air. We would not run. We would not hide. We would do the one thing the hunter would never anticipate. My quest for survival had become a hunt for justice. The night was our shield. Guided by Billy's fearful directions, we didn't flee east. We circled back deep into the heart of Thorne's own territory. We became the ghosts he thought he was hunting. Billy, his debt to my father repaid, pointed us to a secluded canyon where Thorne kept his dynamite before vanishing into the darkness. Vengeance was a fire in my gut, but Nakoma's purpose was greater. We weren't just there to kill Thorne. We were there to obliterate his power. We found the canyon, its entrance guarded by 2 men huddled around a fire, oblivious. I fired a shot from the canyon rim, a deliberate miss that sent them scrambling into confusion. As they fired into the shadows, Nakoma descended upon them like a spirit of vengeance. It was swift, silent, and final. The shed was packed with dynamite. We worked with grim focus, planting charges at the narrow canyon entrance. As Nakoma laid the fuse, the thunder of approaching hooves echoed from the rim. It was Thorne. He hadn't been fooled. He and a dozen riders poured over the edge, their triumphant shouts filling the canyon. He had returned to the heart of his power, and we were caught. "Light it," I urged, my voice tight. Nakoma struck a match, the small flame a beacon of doom. As the fuse caught a tiny snake of fire, eating its way towards oblivion, he yelled, "Go!" We scrambled up the steep canyon wall as Thorne's men charged forward. They saw the burning fuse, their confident shouts dying in their throats. Then the world ended. The explosion was a physical blow, a deafening roar that ripped the air apart. The ground bucked, throwing us flat against the rock as the canyon entrance collapsed in on itself. The avalanche of rock and earth was absolute. Jedediah Thorne and his ambitions were entombed forever in the land he'd killed to possess. Dawn was breaking, a fragile, bruised purple to the east. The long night and the storm of violence was over. We stood on the ridge, two solitary figures, surveying the destruction. The silence was profound. "My path lies east," Nakoma said finally, his voice soft in the quiet morning. "I must tell my father that the war Thorne wanted is over, though the peace is not yet won." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "And I have a cabin to rebuild." He turned to me, his dark eyes holding a universe of unspoken emotion. He gently touched the bandage on his neck. "You have the heart of a warrior, Abigail Hayes. I will not forget what you have done. My people will not forget." He placed his hand over his heart, a gesture of profound respect. Then, as silently as he had entered my life, he was gone, a lone figure walking towards the rising sun. I watched until he was a speck on the horizon. I was alone again, but I was not the same woman. The world was still dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, as the first rays of the new day touched my face, I felt something that felt like hope, a fragile dawn for the land and for me. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the unforgiving heart of the Old West. The story of Abigail and Nakoma is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest storms are the ones that rage within the human heart. If their tale of survival, vengeance, and unlikely alliance moved you, if you felt the bite of that Wyoming wind and the heat of that final fiery dawn, then please help keep these stories alive. Hit that like button to let me know you were here with us on the trail. Share this video with a friend who loves a good old-fashioned Western with twists you never see coming. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more stories from the frontier to share, more unsung heroes to meet, and more legends to forge in the heart of the wild. Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep your powder dry.